long. Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin daf ayin. Today's daf is dedicated by the Hadran women of Long Island in honor of the bar mitzvah of Kyle Lichtman, son of our daf friend, colleague, and co-learner Sharon Gavin Lichtman. As Kyle becomes a full-fledged member of the Jewish nation with all its privileges and obligation, we know that he'll be a source of nachat to your entire family. As he learns from your example of integrity, love of learning, and passion for truth, may we continue to share many smachot. And as usual, we're praying for the health and the safe return of the hostages, for our soldiers, and for all the residents of the north, the south, and of Israel, and around the world. Okay, we're going to get started with, and today's the day we start saying V'tein Tala Matar in Israel, not yet in America. I heard that someone came out with, Rav Kohen came out with a nusach of saying V'tein Tala Matar L'Bracha with but in addition of it not raining down in a way that prevents soldiers from doing what they need to do. Which I thought was interesting. Okay, and very important. So we're going to start now. We have a very interesting daf. We're going to have a very long story in our daf. You might notice, you might not, but you might, if you look ahead, you'll see that we have very, very long dafim coming up. So we'll get started with our daf, but know that we're coming up to a very interesting story. Okay, Gerei v'charure. We're in the middle of this Mishnah that we started in the 4th chapter of the 10 different types of people that Ezra brought up with him when they went to Israel, made Aliyah, when they did the second return for this time of the second temple. Now we want to know, how do we know that these people really came with him? So what's our proof in the text that, now we're going to talk about the Gerei and Charure, that there were converts and there were slaves that were emancipated. Minalan, how do we know? Amar Rav Chisda, da Amar Kra, v'chol hanivdal mitum'at goyei ha'aretz elehem. Says that Jews ate the Korban Pesach, and it says there in Sefer Ezra, chapter 6, that Vayachlu b'nei Yisrael hashavim ma'agolah, the Jews who came back from the exile, and this in the words we just read, Kol hanivdal, all the people who separated from the Tum'ah of Goyei Haaretz, from the impurity of the other nations, and came Elehem lidrosh Hashem Elohei Yisrael, and they basically joined the Jewish people. So from here it seems clear that there were people who joined the Jewish people who came on Aliyah with Ezra. Mamzerim minalan. This one's going to be a little harder to prove. So how do we know that there were mamzerim? Dichtiv. So now they bring a pasul from Nehemiah. It says, "Vayishmas Sanballat ha'Cholani b'Tobiah ha'Eved Hamoni." These are two characters, Gentiles, who, and Tobiah we see as an Eved. Okay, now they are against Nehemiah. They basically come up against him and start saying, they were in charge there, and they feel like he's being a threat to their rule there. In Israel, uchtiv. Now, then it says that there were a bunch of Jews who joined their side, Sanballat and Tobiah. Why did these Jews join their team? And this is now skipping a bunch of chapters. The first pasuk we just quoted was just who these guys were. That was in chapter 2. In chapter 6 of Nehemiah, it says, Ki rabim b'Yehuda ba'alei shvualot. There were a lot of people in Judea who were with them. Okay, they kind of were sworn to them. Ki chatanu l'Shechnia ben Arach b'Yehochanan beno lakachet bat Meshulam ben Brechia. Well, he was the son-in-law of Shechnia ben Arach, who was a Jew, meaning he married a Jewish woman, and his son Yochanan also married a Jewish woman. Now, you have to say, if you want to say they're mamzerim, they say, Kasavar ovei kochavim be'eved haba bat Yisrael havlad mamzer. So now we're going to say, well, Tobiah was an Eved, and right, we're not dealing with Sanballat right now, we're dealing with Tobiah. He was an Eved, and he married a Jewish woman, and his son married a Jewish woman, so that would prove that if you have an Eved or a Gentile who marries a Jewish woman, the Vlad is a mamzer. Now you might say, wait a minute, it's not a mamzer. We learned that it's not a mamzer. Hold off on that. There's a big machloket about whether it's a mamzer or not. So then the Gemara starts with their list of questions. So now they say, right, so number one, they say this, obviously this, whoever put this in the Mishnah and said mamzerim, if we learn mamzerim from this pasuk, you would have to be holding by the fact that a Gentile or a slave who has a child with a Jewish woman, the child will be a mamzer, and then that would be our proof that there's mamzer. But we're going to have 3 problems with this. Number one is the obvious, which is hani chalaman damar havlad mamzer. Elaman damar havlad kasher ma'ika lemeimar. Number one, it only works with one opinion, and it happens. We don't even hold that way. We hold that the vlad is actually not a mamzer. Remember, that's what we learned. The vlad goes by the mother. So basically, the vlad is not even Jewish. So they're not, right? They're not mamzerim because they're not even Jewish. So for example, if that child were to convert, they could marry. Remember, we had a whole thing it was on Friday's stuff about whether they can marry a Kohen or not, but definitely they can marry other people. They're not considered a moms if they convert. So that's number one. what do we do with the other opinion? Number two, how do you know they had sons? Maybe they didn't have sons. Now, Tuvia already said he has a son, but maybe that son was from a different wife. So we don't know that he had a son with this Jewish woman. And we don't know that his son had any children, in which case we have no proof there were mamzerim. And third problem, which is probably an even bigger problem, what were we trying to prove? Not that there were mamzerim living in Israel, but that there were mamzerim who came with Ezra and made aliyah from Babel to Israel. So, how do you know they were in Babylonia, had these wives, and then went to Israel with them? Maybe they had their children there, meaning maybe they were in Israel all along, and maybe there were some Jews left from the time of Gedaliah, and from the time of the destruction of the first temple. Or a lot of Jews living there, but there might have been a few spare Jews, and maybe those men that mentioned in the pasul, he was the son-in-law of, and he was his son married the wife of. Maybe those Jews were there from before, and maybe they had children in Israel, which wouldn't show anything about Ezra bringing them from out of Israel. So based on those three questions, we basically knock out this option. And we bring a different pasul, Elamehacha. And this is something that the rabbis like to do, which is take a list of cities and darshan them and say, well, like we have this in the beginning of Sefer Devarim, where there's Di Zahav, remember, is a reference to the Egel HaZahav. And there's this list of cities, and they darshan what the meaning of each city is. So they're going to do the same thing here. And here it's a pasuk which specifically says who came on Aliyah. Ve'elu ha'olim, and these are the people who came on Aliyah. It's also from Nehemiah. Mitel Melach, from the tale of salt, from the tel Charsha, the tale of Charsha. Okay, we're going to get to what these are. Kruv, Adon, V'imer. We're going to darshan all these things. V'lo yachlu lahagi beit avotam v'zar'am im Yisrael. So all these people who came from the following list of places, and they couldn't tell what their genealogy was, okay, where their families were, whether they're actually really Jews. So now we're going to have a whole list of what this is a reference to. And the first one is basically going to answer our question that we know there were mamzerim. Tel melach, elu b'nei adam shedomim masehem l'maseh stom. Shnefcha letel melach. Remember, stone was turned into salt. So now we're going to say, this is a reference to people who acted like the people of Stone, which means they engaged in illicit relationships, which means that when you do that, you end up with mamzerim. So that's how we know. And then it says, these people came on Aliyah. So melach is a reference to people who engaged in improper relationships, which led to mamzerim. Tel charsha. So charsha means, so cheresh is death. And now we're going to see lahachrish means to silence someone. So we're going to see silence. Zeh shekoreh, now we're going to see a different case in our mission. Zeh shekoreh abba v'imo mishatakto. This is a kid who says, oh, daddy, right? And the mom says, shh, right? That's not your father. That's what we call a shtuki. So that's what this reference of tel charsha is, because lahachrish is to silence. V'lo yachlu lahagiv. Now notice they're skipping. Okay, they're skipping kruv adon v'imer. We're going to come back to it. Usually when we have these drashot, they go one by one parts in the pasuk, but you'll see in a minute why. Because lo yachlu lahagid beit avotam v'zar'am im Yisrael him. Okay, what does that mean? Zehu asufi. Now you know why they skipped, because they wanted to get to mamzer, shtuki, asufi, like the Mishnah listed them like that. Asufi is a kid who's picked up. They didn't know, right, when it says, and they didn't know their genealogy, they didn't know where they came from. That's a sufi. That's someone who was picked up and we don't know who their parents are. So again, they have problematic lineage. They have issues getting married because we don't know what they're married, what their status is. I see someone wrote about stone, about his wife, the wife turned into a pillar of stone. Where do we know that stone was destroyed with salt? So she also turned into a pillar like stone did. That's why the whole area of stone was full of salt, because it was destroyed by salt, according to the Torah. That was part of what was used to destroy it was salt. So the whole city was really destroyed by salt. It's just the story of Lot's wife is kind of more famous, that she turned into a pillar of salt, but in general, the destruction was done with salt. Okay, Kruv Adon V'imer. Amar Rabbi Yavau. So now we go back to those words. What is this a reference to? Well, Adon is God. So Amar Adon, God said, Ani amarti Yehu Yisrael l'fanecha shuvim kechuv. I said that the Jews should be beloved to me like the cherubs, right, that are in the temple, which are like references to angels, right? Their baby it has like a baby image with wings. It's a debate about what exactly the image is, but v'hem samu atzmam kenamel. But they instead behave like leopards. Now, what is a leopard? Okay, why is a leopard a negative thing? So some people say, right, so this is a reference to Kruv Adon V'imer, that God said you should be like Kruv, but instead you were like a Namer. Where do we get Namer from? So I think it's the Maharsha, I forgot who says this, but that The adon ends with a nun, and imer, it's like namel, okay? If you kind of ignore the aleph, which is a silent letter anyway, if you put those two words together, you get namer. Now, a namer is a leopard. What's bad about a leopard? So there's a bunch of different interpretations. Some say that it's spotted, which means like it's a mixed breed. So it's a Jew who married someone who he shouldn't have married. That's one. One is that a namer engages in licentious behavior, marries someone who mated with his friend. Okay? I mean, all animals kind of do that, or I think anyway. The truth is maybe not that all of them. Some of them are more loyal, but a namer is not. So that's also, or namer, like from the lashon of mar, lahamir, or it's a reference to limrod. Maraz is like shimuna hamolim, right? That Moshe says these are rebellious. The namer is rebellious, as so people were rebellious. Okay, so now that's one explanation. This is really the one and the same, but instead it's switching the pasuk to say something actually positive and not negative. Like God said in the first reference, I wanted you to be like my cherubs, and now you turned into leopards. Here it says, Amar Rabbi Yavau, sorry, some say that Amar Rabbi Yavau, that Rabbi Yavau explained this pasuk differently. Amar Adon, God said, God said, I'm gonna still treat you as if you're my special people, even though you behave poorly like leopards. Okay, so either which way the Jews behave poorly, the question is God somewhat rejecting them in that pasuk, or is God saying, I'll love you anyway? So basically, we proved so far is how we know that Gerim and Charurim and emancipated slaves went with Ezra, and now how do we know that mamzerim went up? We tried one pasuk with Tuviyah Ha'eved Hamoni. We rejected that pasuk, and then we brought this pasuk about the Tel Melech. Now, since we're on this pasuk about the Tel Melech, and anyway, this connects with our topic, we're now going to start a slew of pasukim that talk about how you should be careful not to marry women that are not appropriate. Okay, so Amar Rabba Bar Chana Kol Hanose Isha She'ena Hogenet Lo Ma'aleh Alav Katuv Ki'ilu Charsho Lechol Ha'olam Kulo V'Zar'o Melech Shene'amar Ve'elu Ha'olim Mitel Melech Tel Charsha. They take this pasuk and they darshan a little bit differently. That anyone who marries a woman who's not appropriate, and that's kind of because of the end of that pasuk, which is, we have all these people that don't know to tell us their lineage, which means maybe they have problematic lineage, which basically means that someone who has problematic lineage will be like salt and this harsha. So how do they darshan it? Harsha, instead here of being silencing, they learn it to be plowing. They're going to plow the land. It's going to be as if they plowed the land and planted salt, which basically is going to destroy the land. And it's a way of saying that when you marry people that are not appropriate, now we'll talk about in a minute what does it mean not appropriate, you basically make the land desolate. Okay, now what does it mean to marry women that are not appropriate? It either means that you're marrying people with a bad yichus, right? You're marrying a Gentile woman or a arayot, whether it's a relative you're not allowed to marry, or a slave or something like that. Or it could mean, some of the commentaries say, someone with bad action, someone who comes from a bad family, someone who, is just not a good person. And then you're also basically, that's according to those people, that's just as bad. Which is interesting because we always have this debate between born into, right? And who you are for your own sake, not necessarily just because you're born into a bad family. So there's like a bit of a balancing game here between who's bad because they were a bad, they were born into a bad lineage, and who's bad because of their actions. Now we have an interesting line. Amarav of Ad Amarav. A man who marries a woman for her money. Now, this is taken by many commentaries to mean if you marry someone who has a bad lineage, but why did you marry her? Because she's wealthy. Okay. In other words, it's a combination. It's not just marrying her for her money, but it's marrying someone who's disqualified from being married. And you're particularly, what motivated you to marry her just because you want her money? You're going to have children that are not good children. There's a way of a deterrent for people to do this kind of thing. They rebelled against God because they gave birth to strange sons, or inappropriate sons. And this is basically saying this is a reference to the fact that they marry them for their money. How do we know this? Because the next part of the pasuk says the following: Shema Tamar Mamon Palat. You might think that maybe they'll have bad children, but maybe they'll keep the money. Talmud Lomar, Ata Yochlem Chodesh Echelkehem. Okay, that's the end of that pasuk. So they rebelled against God because they had bad children, or they will have bad children because of that. And now within a month, basically, their chelek, their portion, the money they had, is going to be destroyed. Or taken away from them. Their enemies are going to come take it. Now, the issue here is basically saying you obviously did it for the money, and therefore you're going to be punished also by the money. Not only are you going to be punished because you're going to have bad sons, but also the money is going to be taken away from you. They specifically say their portion, plural, to say it's not just his money he's going to lose, but he's going to lose her money as well, which could mean his money he came into before and her money that he tried to get to by marrying her. Or it could mean, Rashi says it's the distinction between nichsei tzon barzel and nichsei melog, the property of hers that becomes his, right, that he is kind of becomes more the owner of and still has to return them, but right, it's more that they're owned by him versus the stuff that's like she got an inheritance is more owned by her, even though he still gets the proceeds. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all the differences between those two types, but perhaps that's, Rashi says that's what this is referring to. He's going to lose all that. If you think it's going to take up a lot of time until he loses all this money, no, Talmud Lamar Chodesh, it means a month. It'll happen all quickly in a month. My mashma, how do you get this? Okay, that's how they say before the month goes out, basically, the money is going to be gone. But okay, now this I wanted to just point out. This is very interesting. Halacha l'maaseh. Okay, so what does this mean? So we did say that this really seems to be saying that you will be disqualified if you're basically all this will happen to you. You'll lose the money, and your sons will be bad if you marry a woman who is, again, it didn't say this word in the context, but you married her for her money when she happens to be psula. She's someone you're not allowed to marry. So the Raman, the Shulchan Aruch, basically says, when the Shulchan Aruch in Even HaEzer, in the second siman, it's in the mamash in the beginning of Even HaEzer, in the Shulchan Aruch it says, Lo yisa adam isha she'en ba shum pasul. You can't marry someone who's disqualified in any way. The Rama says, and kol anusei isha psula mishum mamon, havin labanim she'enam mehuganim. Okay, but bilav hachi she'enam psula alav. But if she's not disqualified, and shenosam mishum mamon, and you're marrying her for her money, mutal. Very fascinating. He says marrying a woman for her money alone is not a bad thing. She's a nice Jewish family, and you marry her for her money. That's not a bad thing. Very fascinating. He says this, but he then says, very fascinating, and I believe that he must be saying this because of an incident that happened, but I can't prove this. But he then says further on, he says, if someone basically promised him a lot of money to marry a particular woman, okay, so he says basically, right, you marry this woman, I'll give you $100,000, okay, and then you marry the woman, and then the person doesn't give you the money. Okay, so what do you do in that situation, right? It's interesting, he's making up the situation, so I wonder if this really happened. Lo ya'agen kalato mishum zeh, v'lo yitkotet ba'avur nichsei ishto. Don't keep her in aguna, okay? Don't keep her in this marriage until you get your money and say, basically, I'm not going to live with you, but I'm also not going to give you a get until the guy gives me the money. You can't do that, okay? So while you shouldn't marry him, while it's okay to marry a woman for her money, but not in an abusive manner, basically, he says. And then he says, and Misho Seken, and anyone who does this, right? And also, you shouldn't be fighting for your wife's money, like if that's the case, you know. And anyone who does this, right? He won't be successful, and he won't be able to find a good wife to marry after that, because the money he takes is not appropriate, right? It's not his to take, etc. And the Rama basically goes very strongly against anyone who tries to hold back a get for getting money from the wife's property or getting money from someone who promised money for the wedding. Okay, so anyway, that's an interesting halacha. So let's move on. We're continuing with these statements about people and inappropriate marriages. Amar Rabba bar Rav Ada, same person as we had the second statement. But Amar Rabbi Sala, Amar Rav Amnuna, some people quote it in his name. Okay, Eliyahu ties up his hands. If you do that, if you marry someone not appropriate, Eliyahu ties up your hands, and God himself comes and gives you lashes. Obviously, this is a vision, not a reality. Vitana al kulam Eliyahu kotev HaKadosh Baruch Hu chotem, and there's a braita that says even more. Eliyahu writes this down. If you do this, God signs his name on it. Okay, woe is to the man who disqualifies, and what's the problem here? You're disqualifying not just you're doing a terrible act, but you're disqualifying your children as well by marrying someone with, you know, the wrong lineage, or even if she's a bad person, you're just basically creating bad children in the world. And you're pogem mishpachto, you cause a bad name for your family. And anyone who marries a woman that's not appropriate, Eliyahu koftov HaKadosh Baruch Hu rotzo. And the braita says the same thing, which is Eliyahu ties him up and God gives him lashes. The braita continues, and this is going to be the lead into our story. V'chol haposel pasul. anyone who says about other people that they're pasul, okay, you start calling people an eved or a Gentile when they're believed to be Jewish, he himself is pasul. Okay, if you say to someone else, you're pasul, that means you yourself are pasul, or at least you have to be concerned for. Okay, it means you have to worry that maybe this person is really just projecting his blemish on others. Right? It's often they say people who, right, when kids are fighting and people say mean things to the kid, the parents will say to the kid, the kid who got beaten up, don't worry, it's really, he's got the problem, not you, right? It's him trying to make himself feel better by putting you down, but it's him really who's got the issue. Someone who doesn't praise anybody else is basically himself. It's an indicator that he himself is a problem. And as you're quoting Miriam, here we have it, Amar Shmuel bimumo posel. Okay, anyone who disqualifies others is clearly, it's a very famous line, right? Bimumo posel. He's basically disqualifying him in the same way that he himself has a problem. So again, if you call someone an eved, that means you're an eved. Or at least we have to be concerned that maybe you're an eved. It doesn't really mean that he's definitely an eved, but you have to worry that maybe he has a faulty lineage himself, and that it's specifically the one he's calling you is the one that's really in him. So that leads us to our story. Okay, you ready for a big story? Let's do some background. Rav Yehuda and Rav Nachman are going to be the two main characters in our story, plus this man who is going to hop in. So let's just talk about, first of all, we're going to have some geography here. Rav Yehuda was from Pumbedita. Okay, he was the student of Rav, and then this became the student of Shmuel when Rav died, and learned in the yeshiva in Pumbedita and became the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedita. He was a very big scholar. We see him quoting all the time from Rav and from Shmuel. Shmuel viewed him as like his prize student. He's a big, huge Talmud Chacham, second generation of Amoraim. Then we have Rav Nachman, who's a little bit younger than him, also prominent, but not as prominent. And in addition to his prominence, though, he was a rabbi, he also was married to Yalta, who was the daughter of the Reish Galuta. And I'm sure you remember the Yalta stories that we've seen until now, who was an interesting character who will come up again, make a cameo appearance in our daf today. So it seems from this story, they didn't know each other. Okay, Rav Nachman was in Hadran, and Rav Yehuda was in Pumbedita. And it seems that Rav Nachman didn't know who Rav Yehuda was, and presumably Rav Yehuda didn't really know who Rav Nachman was, although it's not clear. So let's see the story. So there was a guy from Hadran, from the city of Rav Nachman. He goes into a butcher shop in Pumbedita, in the city of Rav Yehuda. So he's waiting online in the butcher shop. So he says to the guy there, give me some meat. That's what you normally do when you're in a butcher shop. You have to wait. First, the shamash of Rav Yehuda gets, okay, his messenger, basically, the person they're shopping for it, of Rav Yehuda bar Yechezkel is Rav Yehuda. He's the brother, if you remember, of Rami bar Yechezkel. And after we give him, we'll give you. Okay, he gets first. Amal, so this guy was very annoyed by this. Why does he have to wait? Okay, it's a good question whether the shaliach was in the store already, or maybe they were waiting to give him, first dibs on the meat until he shows up, probably, right? And when maybe he came every day, and therefore they always waited till he came before they gave out meat to anybody else, and this really annoyed him. So he said, Yehuda bar Shviskal. Who's this Yehuda bar Shviskal? He makes a play on Yechezkel, calls it Shviskal. Rashi says the Shviskal is someone who's like a crazy meat eater, okay? And in a very negative way, he calls Rav Yehuda. Why is he going to get before me? So obviously Rav Yehuda's messengers get back and say, Rav Yehuda, this guy's insulting you in the butcher shop. Shamte. He puts the guy in excommunication for speaking that way about Rav Yehuda. Amru, then the people told him, about this guy, Ragil Dekari Inashe Avde. And this is the important part for our purposes. He calls people slaves. He's known to be, trying to disqualify other people. So Rav Yehuda says, this guy is an eved. He declares him an eved. Now, before when we saw this, we said, you have to be concerned for this. But he went farther and he said, this guy is definitely a slave, and basically announced it and humiliated this guy, right? Which this guy got very annoyed, obviously. So the guy obviously went back home, went to Rav Nachman and said, look what happened to me when I went to Pumbedita. This guy, Rav Yehuda, put me in nidoy. He called me a slave. And Rav Nachman basically subpoenas Rav Yehuda to his court. I take pitka de hazmano. Okay, so now Rav Yehuda takes the subpoena, the paper or whatever it was on at the time, and he takes the subpoena and he goes to, now you expect him to go to Rav Nachman to go to his court, but no. Also, Rav Yehuda came to Rav Huna. He brings the subpoena to Rav Huna, okay, which was someone he knew and was in connection with. Amar le Ezel lo Ezel. He says, listen, I need some advice. Should I go or should I not go? Now, I've been subpoenaed to Rav Nachman's court, but what's the problem? Well, the problem is that Rav Yehuda is greater than Rav Nachman. Okay, and in fact, I looked this up because I didn't really understand. So what? Well, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, okay, probably based on this, that if you are called to a judge who's a lower status than you, you actually don't have to go. The judge can't force you to come to their court. What you would do is, if there's some sort of issue like this, so Rav Yehuda would get a court together of a bunch of chachamim that are, at his caliber, or at least like in his town, and they would rule. That's what the Shulchan Aruch paskins. You don't really have to go. If a lower judge subpoenas you to court, you don't have to go. So Amar le, Rav Huna says to him, you don't really have to go, based on what I just explained. Mishum de Gavar Rabbah, because you're a greater scholar than he is. Ela mishum yikar de bein nisia kum zil. But you know what? In this case, he's got one up on you, which is he's part of the Beit HaNasi, he's part of the Exilarch's family. And remember, that's the Reish Galuta, that's Yalta's father, was the Reish Galuta. He married in, and we have all these stories of Rav Nachman, and most of them are actually critical of him being part of this Reish Galuta's family. You might remember the Reish Galuta was very wealthy, and he was a prominent person, but he wasn't necessarily so learned. And a lot of it was these stories about their wealth and the way they use their wealth, etc. And, interesting also, we have this story of Rav Nachman marries this very wealthy woman. We talked about before about marrying a woman for her wealth. Anyway, obviously she didn't have problematic lineage, but there is something going on here that we're going to see throughout the story. So he basically says you should go because he's from the house of the Nasi, and you shouldn't defend the house of the Nasi. So when he gets there, what's Rav Nachman doing? He's putting up a fence around his roof, okay, which is very interesting. Like a fence protects us. We've been talking about pasul marriages and people on the in and people on the out, and also the Reish Galuta's house was certain people were allowed in, certain people were not allowed in. So he puts up this okay, he's busy basically putting up this fence around his property. Now, or like a railing. So Rav Yehuda walks into Rav Nachman's house, sees him putting up this okay, and he says, I don't understand what you're doing. Aren't you an important, prominent person? Don't you know? Now, you're going to notice throughout this story, sometimes Rav Yehuda talks on his own. Sometimes he quotes Shmuel. He quotes Shmuel a lot in this story. If you remember also, how did we start? Shmuel was the one who said, call a pasul b'mumo pasul, right? If you disqualify someone else, you're doing it with, right? It's because you have your own, you have the same blemish yourself. And he seems to be going in the way of Shmuel, which makes sense because he was his student. So now it quotes Rav Yehuda saying in the name of Shmuel, once you become in a public position, you shouldn't do manual labor. Okay, it's not appropriate in front of three people. Okay, what's the issue? There's a number of possibilities. Either it shows that the people are basically not doing what they're supposed to. They're supposed to let you do your job and basically take care of all this stuff for you. Or it's maybe showing that you don't think of yourself as important enough, and that will cause other people not to respect you. There's all different possibilities. You can, go with it where you'd like. So he says to him, Porta de gunderita hu de ka'avi. Okay, I was just making a very small one. It's not really such hard work. And he calls it a gunderita instead of calling it a ma'akeh. Well, Rav Yehuda says to him, why are you using such fancy language? And this is again a critique of, Rav Nachman, who lived in the Reish Galuta's house and had this. They were part of the noble men, and they spoke in a different language. He said, what is this word you're using? Why don't you use ma'akeh that's written in the Torah? Or mechitza is what the rabbis call it, but use one of those languages. Why are you using some highfalutin language? Amalei yativ mar ar karpita. So now he says, come sit down on my bench, but he calls it a karpita. Amalei umisane sapsal de amar Rabbanan. What is sapsal, the rabbinic term, not good enough for you? Oh, itztiba de amrei nashe, or what normal people on the street call it an itztiba. Here, see, it's not just right. There's Torah, there's the rabbis, and then there's what people on the street use. And who are you to use some language that nobody understands? Amalei. So now Rav Nachman says to him, Lechomar etrunga. Why don't you eat an etrog? But he calls it an etrunga. To which Rav Yehuda responds, Amalei hachi amar Shmuel. Shmuel said, Kol haomer utrunga tilta baram berucha. If you use the word utrunga, it's a third of arrogance. Okay, this is really not a good thing. It's showing you're higher and above everybody else. Oh, etrog kedikari Rabbanit. Oh, etrog adamrei nashe. Either use the language that rabbis use, which is etrog, or use etroga, which is what people on the street use. Amarle, lishtemar anbaga. Why don't you drink some anbaga? Amarle, misani ispargus to kari Rabbanan or anpag to amri nashi. You might remember this asparagus. It sounds like asparagus. It's some drink they used to drink that was good for medicinal purposes. So he offers him this drink and he says, why are you calling it this? This is not what the rabbis call it. It's not what the people call it. Amarle, titi donag tishkan. Or my daughter's going to come. Her name is Donag. She's going to give us something to drink. Amarle, haki amar Shmuel. He says, didn't Shmuel say, you're not supposed to have a woman serve you. It's not appropriate. It might cause, if a woman comes into the room serving you this drink, it might cause something to go on between, men and her. It's not an appropriate thing to do. Tanahi, to which Rav Nachman says she's a minor, nothing's going to happen. To which he says, Beferish Amar Shmuel, what are you talking about? Shmuel explicitly said, Shmuel said, whether she's older, whether she's younger, it doesn't make a difference. You don't do this. Here comes Yalta, okay? How so? Well, Rav Nachman says, don't you want to send hello to my wife? Which is a very strange thing for him to have asked, and all the more so, Rav Yehuda is very offended by this. This is normally used to say you shouldn't sing, but also it must mean you shouldn't talk to women when it could, again, lead to something inappropriate. And for a man going to say hello to another man's wife would be inappropriate, especially here. He doesn't even know her, right? One thing if they're friends, but here they obviously don't know each other. Why on earth would he be saying hello to his wife? To which he says, if you could send a messenger to send a message of hello to my wife. Amarle, Haki Amar Shmuel, he says, well, Shmuel says, okay, turning now to Amabet, Ein shoalim b'shalom isha. Okay, you don't even ask how a woman's doing, even if you do it with a messenger. Because also what might happen? Well, the messenger might start up with her, right? They might start engaging in some sort of conversation, which could lead to who knows what. Al yidei ba'alai, he says, well, Rav Nachman says, you could do it through me. You can send a messenger of hello to my wife through me. Amarle, Hachi Amar Shmuel, it keeps pulling out Shmuel. This is what Shmuel says, Ein shalim b'shalom isha klal. Shmuel was against any kind of asking how your wife's doing. It's just not appropriate. Well, maybe because they were talking about her, Yalta didn't like this. She was obviously overhearing this conversation, and she starts to butt in, and she says, listen. And again, this shows the intelligence of Yalta. Shachale debitu, so his wife sends to him a message. Okay, maybe she, I don't know what, somehow gets a message into the room. Shari le tagre de lo nashvuch kishar ma'aretz. Release this guy, like let him do his business, figure out what on earth he's doing here, and let him out of here, because he's going to turn you into an Ama Aretz, meaning he's making you look like an idiot. This Rav Yehuda is winning you every stage of this conversation. Every single thing you say, he knocks you down. This isn't good for your image. Okay, get rid of him. So Amalei, and which is funny because after he uses all this highfalutin language, Rav Yehuda knocks him down, he again uses a word that we don't really know, which must be also some highfalutin language. My shiyate demar hachi. Okay, shiyate is a word we don't really see. Anyway, saying, what are you doing here? Okay, it's like, okay, well, why'd you show up at my house? Just to insult me? What are you doing here? Amalei, taska dahazmanuta shad yomar batre. He says, you invited me here. You subpoenaed me. Amalei, he says, really? And this is why it's clear Rav Nachman didn't know who Rav Yehuda was, because otherwise he would have known he subpoenaed him. He says, I can't even keep up with your language. You're much smarter than me. There's no way that I could have subpoenaed you. You're obviously on a higher level than me. You're in a, more prominent than I am. There's no way I sent you a subpoena. So he takes his subpoena out of his bosom, from his bosom, and he shows it to him. Amarle hagavra hadiska. He says, here's the guy, and here's my subpoena. Amarle ho'il ba'atamar lahacha lishtayimile. He says this very interesting line. He says, listen, if you're already here, because even though I'm not really supposed to judge you, you're obviously more important than I am, but you're already here. Tell me the story. And here's the important line. So people don't say that the rabbis show favoritism to each other. And basically, I'm going to let you go just because you're a rabbi. Okay, he says that won't look good for my image, which is funny because all along he's been showing this image that's really not the right image. And Rav Yehuda is being very critical of him. All of a sudden he says here, well, I got to watch out for my image, what people are going to think of me. Again, I think this story has a lot of criticism of the rabbis and perhaps the rabbi specifically who's the Reish Galuta's rabbi and him using his power, right? And then in the end, he kind of realizes, well, I better be careful about how I use my power and not to use it to protect other rabbis because I'll get a lot of flack for that. And again, what do you have here? It's the issue of the yichus, right? In other words, he's an important person because he's a rabbi and, not to use differential treatment with people who have different yichus than other people. Possibly it's connected, maybe this whole topic. Anyway, Amar le, my tamasham telamar lahu gavra. Why did you excommunicate this guy? Okay, once Rav Yehuda tells him the story, he says, why did you excommunicate him? Siar shlicha de Rabbanan. He tortured, he was really mean to my messenger. V'nagdemar. So Rav Nachman says to him, why don't you just give him lashes? To Rav mangid aman de mitzar shlucha de Rabbanan. Rav will give lashes for someone who abused the messengers of the rabbis. So he said, because remember, it was just the messenger of Rav Yehuda that was in the store. He said, I wanted to punish him as severely as I could, so I took it up a level. Instead of just lashes, I excommunicated. That seems to be sufficient for Rav Nachman. My tama achriz mara le de. But then he says, why did you say he's a slave? Amar to ragil dekari inashe avde. Well, he was calling other people avadim, and that was enough to suspect that he was a slave. Vitane, and he says, he quotes now the source, the braita, kol pasul pasul, ve'ino medaber b'shivchal alma, ve'amar Shmuel b'mumo posel. And so you have it between the braita and Shmuel. We basically say, anyone who says, right, the braita just says someone who disqualifies someone else is himself disqualified, but Shmuel added disqualified in the same way that he's trying to disqualify someone else. To which Rav Nachman says to him, he said you have to be concerned that maybe, but he didn't say go announce it and say definitively this person is a slave. So how did you take it farther? Well, like every good story, adahachi, bahachi, in the meanwhile, what happens, and this in parentheses, but obviously you have to read this, otherwise it doesn't make sense. Well, the guy who was in the butcher shop, who's, his guy he's arguing with, shows up at the court. So the guy says to Rav Yehuda, you call me an Eved, but I have good yichus. I came from the Cheshmonai kingdom. You can't argue with that. That's good yichus. Amar le, to which Rav Yehuda pulls out, what are you talking about? Amar Shmuel, my Rabbi Shmuel said, Kol de Amar midibei Cheshmonai katina avde. Anyone who says they come from the Cheshmonai family is a slave. Remember, the Cheshmonaim were both Kohanim and they were kings. He says, you say you're Beit Cheshmonai, you're a slave. Well, the question is, do they accept this statement of his that he says this in the name of Shmuel? To which Rav Nachman says, Amar lo savar lamal tahada amar Rabbi Abba amar Rav Huna amar Rav. Don't you hold by what Rabbi Abba quoted Rav Huna saying in the name of Rav that Kol tamich chacham shemoreh halacha uba im kodem aseh amara shomin lo b'im lav ein shomin lo. If someone's convicted of something and he pulls out, my rabbi said this to defend himself, we don't believe him unless he said it before it happened. If you had quoted Shmuel 3 weeks ago as saying this, we'd accept it. But you're quoting it right now because you're being convicted and, maybe you're just making it up. How do we know you're telling the truth? We only know you're telling the truth if you say it before it's really something that's going to help support you. So right before the maaseh, before an action happens. So Amar Lei says, fine, you don't believe me? Ika Rav Matna dekai kavate. Rav Matna holds like me. Okay, well, where's this Rav Matna? Well, now the story tells you there's a great, the story is building up on the suspense and the and the miraculous nature of the story. And they tell you Rav Matna lochati l'nehardat le'soshne. Rav Matna hadn't come to Neharda in 13 years. But somehow, on that day, he shows up in Neharda. So he says Rav Matna, and poof, Matna's there. Now, he wants to remind him of what the statement, but he can't direct him because that would be a directed question that might be leading, right, like leading the witness. So what does he say? Do you remember what Shmuel said that day? Where he had 1 foot on the banks of the river and 1 foot in the ferry that was taking him to the other side, okay, where he was like neither here nor there. Again, I don't know what the image is trying to conjure up some image of being on unstable ground, being in 2 places at once, I'm not sure. But anyway, Amar le hachi Amar Shmuel, he said, this is what Shmuel said. Yeah, sure, of course I remember that day. And what he said was, Kol de Amar mibei Cheshmonai malka katina avdehu. Anyone says I come from the kingdom of the Cheshmonai kings is definitely a slave. Why? Well, he says even more. Delo ishtayur minayu elahi revita desalka leigra v'ram yakala v'amra kol da'amar mibei Cheshmonai ana avdehu naflami igra umeta. because there was no one left in the Beit Hashmonai family. And how do we know this? Because if you remember, King Herod, okay, we're going to get to the story in Baba Batra. King Herod on the second page in Baba Batra, Daf Gimel, there's a whole story of King Herod and how he basically killed all the Hashmonite kings and then left this one woman over because he left her one woman from the Hashmonite kingdom because he wanted to marry her. And she basically, before she commits suicide because she didn't want to marry Herod, she basically goes up to the roof. She screams out to everybody, anyone who says they're from the Hashmonite kingdom is lying and they're a slave because there's really no one left anymore. He killed everybody. Also, remember, Herod, they claim, was a slave. And he's claiming to be the new Hashmonite kingdom. And basically, she commits suicide, okay? And basically, know that he wiped everybody out, and anyone who claims that is really a slave. So basically, Rav Yehuda wins out the argument. So they now announce this guy is clearly an Eved, because now that he said, I'm from the Hashmonite kingdom, that made it clear that he's a slave. So that day, tons of ketubah were torn up because all these people who claimed they were from the Hashmonite kingdom were now declared slaves. And then if the woman was from the Hashmonite kingdom, the husband could say this was a mekach ta'ud, it was a mistake, and they could tear their ketubahs and not have to give them anything. Kikan nafik, nafke abatre l'mirgama. Now, when Rav Yehuda leaves the town, you have to remember, again, this is a bit of a Nehardea Pumbedita story. So Rav Yehuda is from Pumbedita. The story happened in Pumbedita, but the guy who did the insulting was from Nehardea. He summons Rav Nachman from Nehardea, summons Rav Yehuda from Pumbedita to court. And now Rav Yehuda finishes. Not only did he destroy this guy's reputation, destroyed a bunch of other people's reputation. And basically now he goes to leave the city and the people go out to stone him. They're like, why did you come to our city and destroy the lineage of all these people? So Amar Lahu, he says to them, listen, ishtiku shtiku. If you're quiet, it'll be good for you. Ilo, if you try to stone me with these stones and make a big stink, migalina alayhu hada Amar Shmuel, tarte zarayati ika ben hardea. I'm going to basically tell you, I'm going to basically make it clear, which Shmuel said, which is there's two basic families, the whole city of Nehardea. Chad mikraya debe Yona v'chad mikraya debe Orbati. Okay, great, connected to Parshat Shavua. The raven, right? Well, we just read yesterday, Noach, the raven, and the dove. The dove is the symbol of the peace and the good, and the raven is the symbol of the bad. Right? It's not exactly bad in that story, but he's also not good. Right? He goes, he doesn't come back. Anyway, so the Yonah, there's one that's called the Yonah, one that's called the Orev. And v'simanech tameh tameh tahor tahor. And the way we call it is, right, that's tameh tameh and that's tahor tahor, right? Some are impure, some are pure. Shadu alahu rigma miyadayu. So they took all their stones, they put it in the river. V'kam it b'benahar malka. There were so many stones that they had taken to stone him that now they didn't use, because what happened was, it seems a bunch of families it became clear, but a bunch of other families it wasn't so clear, and they were worried he was going to disqualify them as well. So he said to them, if you stone me, well, I'll make it worse for you. So you better be quiet, otherwise I'll keep my mouth shut about, really say what, and specifying exactly who's part of this family. By the way, I just want to point out, there's another story with Rav Nachman and his daughters. You might remember from Gittin that they get taken into captivity, and Elish goes with them, and Elish is like, yeah, first he doesn't even go with them into captivity. He's just saying, oh, wow, Rav Nachman's daughters are great. And they get taken captive, and then he makes himself get taken captive also with them to see, are they really great, like they seem. And then it turns out his daughters really end up engaging in licentious behavior with their captors. And then there's this whole story there where the raven, then they go to run away, and he's trying to decide, should he go with them or should he not? Are they good or are they bad? And he doesn't know. And then the raven tells him something and he doesn't listen, and the dove tells him something and he does. And it's very interesting that both these stories have to do with Rav Nachman. Both of them have this image of the Yonah and the raven. Anyway, there's more to be done with these stories, but we're going to move on. Okay, that's where the story ends, but we hear more about this, which is Machruz Rav Yehuda b'Pedita. Whether it's when he got home from the story or in general, in his own town, he started announcing, Ada b'Yonatan Avdi, Yehuda bar Papa mamzerim, Bati bar Tuvia b'Ramut Rucha lo shakil gita dechiruta. The daughter of Tuvia was never free. Okay, these guys are mamzerim. These guys are slaves. Machruz Rabba b'Mechozer, he also makes this announcement, Balai, Denai, Talai, Malai, Zagai, all those names, those last names, Kulam Lifsol, they're all disqualified families. Amar Rav Yehuda, Govai or Givonai, they're from Givon, those are the Nitinim that are not allowed to marry. Duri Ninita, Durai Nitinai, it's also a family name that is a reference to Nitinim. Amar Rav Yosef, Hai Bekubi de Pumbedita Kulam de Avde. Rav Yosef says the whole city of Pumbedita, I'm sorry, Bekubi of Pumbedita, it's like a little part of Pumbedita, they're all slaves. Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Arba Meot Avdim, V'Amar Le'abat Alafim Avdim, Ayul Pashko Ben Imar. There were 400 or perhaps 4,000 slaves for this one guy. V'Kulam Nitmu B'Kehuna, and they all married Kohanim. So now we have a problem that maybe all these Kohanim are from slaves. V'Chol Kohen Sheyesh Lo Azuk Panim Eno Ela Mehatam. How do we know? Well, we look at their actions. Again, this is a connection between bad lineage and bad actions. If they're contentious, they fight with each other, then it's a sign that they're slaves. And they all sit. Okay, now, either this is in some street in Nahardea, or maybe it's they all sit in the Beit Midrash in a row, and like they're all, kind of appearing as prominent people, but they're really not. They're really problematic. Upliga to Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Elazar had a totally different approach. And here you see different approaches to this whole thing. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Imra Ita Kohen, Ba'azut Metzach, Al Tar Heracharav. Kohanim that fight with each other, don't think that that's a problem in their lineage. The nation is like Kohanim who fight with each other. You might remember from Yoma, Kohanim always fight with each other, right? Over who gets to do this avoda, and one guy's even stabbed another guy. That's something from way back when. That's not a sign of problematic lineage. And in fact, Shulchan Aruch paskins, you don't have to start worrying. You see a family, we can assume. You don't have to start checking their Judaism and worrying about, their lineage. Then it goes into, well, it could be if they're Kohanim and there's a Metzach, then you have to worry about it. Okay, so there's this problem because it sort of says assume everyone's good unless you have reason to believe otherwise. And then the big question becomes, what is a reason to believe otherwise? And this is something that goes on very often now when people go to get married, particularly in Israel, where the rabbis come and say, well, we don't believe you're Jewish, and prove you're Jewish. And the question is that okay? Is it not okay? Is that, don't we say everyone is bechezkat kashrut? On the other hand, maybe you say, but unless there's reason to believe not, and the Rabbanit believes there's reason to believe not. So this is a big debate about where we're supposed to side on this issue, and is this okay to do? Is it not okay to do? That's a big question that really comes out of our sugya. Okay, we'll finish up the daf quickly. Amar Rabbi Avin bar Rav Ad Amar Rav. We're back to statements. We finished the story. We finished that they pasuled all a bunch of other people, and now we go back to these general statements. Kol anosei isha she'ena hogenet lo. God rests his presence on all the nations and says, you're my nation. He doesn't do it to people who married out. If they're the Shvatim of God, because they're married each other, then it's good. If they married people with problematic lineage, then God won't testify about them that they're part of his nation. When he brings his presence down to Jewish people, he only does it on the families that have good lineage. In that time I will be the God to all the Jews. But what does it say? Not to all the Jews, to all the families of Jews. It doesn't say to all the Jews, to the families. That means only the families that have good lineage. And then it says, and then as God says, I will put my presence upon you, and then you'll be my nation. Now we're going to go off on a tangent about this. This is the difference between born Jews and converts, because born Jews, God rests his presence, and then we become his nation. But in that order. But who is the one who turns to come to me? And you want to become my nation, you'll become my nation. Only after they show their intent does God come and become their God. So in the end, he becomes the God of everybody, but he'll only rest his presence once the ger is proven they really want to be part of the Jewish people. Whereas someone born Jewish doesn't have to prove it at all. God comes to him before he actually becomes part, right? Feels like that connection to the nation. And we'll end with this one complicated statement. Amar Rabbi Chelbo kashim gerim liYisrael kesapachat. They're like a sapachat. Shneimar v'nileh hager alehem v'nisbechu abei Yaakov, which usually means they were annexed to the Jewish people. But k'tiv hacha v'nisbechu k'tiv hatam laseif lasapachat. Lasapachat is mentioned together with a leprous mark called the seif. Sapachat is a negative word. So it says converts, according to this, are difficult to Jews like sapachat. What does this statement mean? So Rashi says they don't keep mitzvot like the born Jews do. So that's a problem with converts, and Rashi views this as a negative statement about converts, which is difficult because there's so many statements that are positive about converts, and we're not supposed to say not nice things to converts, etc. So Tosfot goes against Rashi entirely and lists. You can glance at the Tosfot; it's a very long Tosfot. He lists a number of other possibilities. So I'll give you one for example, and with that we'll finish our daf, which is that they do mitzvah better than the born Jews do because they're new and they come to it with a lot of excitement and fervor, and it makes the born Jews look worse because we don't do it as well as they do. So that's a way of flipping it on its head and showing it's not that the converts are bad, it's just they, and that's why it says they're kashim to Yisrael, like sapachat. They make it worse for us because they do things better than we do, which is an interesting way of understanding it. Tosfot brings a whole bunch of other explanations because he doesn't accept Rashi's that we look negatively upon converts. Okay, so with that, we'll finish our daf. We basically proved how we know Gerim and Charurim came, how we know mamzerim came with Ezra, and then we started with a slew of statements about how bad it is to marry someone that's not of the right yichus, or perhaps also not of the right behavior. And with that, within that, we saw this famous long story between Rav Nachman and Rav Yehuda, which seems to be not only a criticism on the people on the outside, but also a bit of a criticism on the people on the inside, which I think also is a reference in that story that it's not just people with bad lineage that need critique here and there. It's also sometimes the people on the inside that treat people on the outside differently. Anyway, with that, we'll finish our daf and wishing everybody a good day, a good week, and the rain come b'bracha, and that we start to have more bracha in our country, in Israel, and in the world at large. Wishing everybody a good week.